Welcome to the deep dive. Looks like our listeners are really fascinated by this whole systems thinking thing. We got a mountain of material here. History of science, ecology, even some economics thrown in. It's like everyone wants to figure out how it all fits together.
Yeah.
So, ready to deep dive into systems thinking and see how it can change the way we see the world.
Absolutely. It's a real game changer. The best way to wrap your head around systems thinking is to look at how it came about. See, for centuries, science was all about looking at the world like a giant machine, breaking it down into its individual parts.
Right, like taking a clock apart to see how each gear works.
Exactly. Think Descartes and his clockwork universe, or Newton's laws of motion. Huge breakthroughs, no doubt. But like with any model, there are limitations.
So you're saying that eventually scientists hit a wall trying to explain everything with just gears and springs?
You got it. Think about the human body, for instance. We tried to make sense of it purely mechanically. The heart's a pump, the lungs are bellows. But that kind of thinking just couldn't explain things like consciousness, could it? Or the intricate web of relationships in an ecosystem.
So it sounds like there was this major shift, moving away from dissecting things into parts and towards understanding them as a whole.
Exactly. That's the heart of systems thinking. And what's really interesting is that this shift happened across different fields almost at the same time. In the 1940s, Ludwig von Bertalanffy, a biologist, proposed this idea of general system theory. Around the same time, you had cybernetics emerging, exploring feedback loops, not just in machines, but in living organisms, too. It was like everyone was starting to see the same patterns.
Okay, so interconnectedness, feedback loops, these are the core concepts of systems thinking.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding that things exist in networks, in relationships. It's like that butterfly effect idea. A tiny change in one part of the system can ripple out and affect the whole thing. Imagine a spider's web, right? You touch one strand and the whole web vibrates.
Wow, that's a great analogy. So how does this new way of thinking, this systems thinking, affect how we understand something like business, for example?
Well, imagine you're running a company, but you're stuck in that old mechanistic view. You'd probably try to optimize each department separately, like they're isolated units. But a systems thinker, they'd be looking at how those departments interact, how information flows between them, those all-important feedback loops. They see the company as a living network.
So not just a bunch of separate parts, but an entire organism.
Exactly. And this applies to so much more than just business. Think about healthcare, ecology, even global challenges systems thinking gives us this new lens for navigating complexity. It's like upgrading from a magnifying glass to a wide-angle lens.
So you're saying it's not just some abstract theory. Systems thinking is a powerful tool for making sense of the real world.
Precisely. And that's why it's so relevant for every listening, right? It changes how you see the world, how you make decisions, even how you understand your place in the grand scheme of things.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork here. We've got the basics of systems thinking down. Where do we go from here?
Now we get to the really interesting stuff. We'll dive into how this shift in thinking has revolutionized specific fields of science. We'll explore those hidden connections between things that seem totally unrelated, and we'll look at the huge implications systems thinking has for tackling the challenges of the 21st century.
Sounds like we're just getting started. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with part 2 where we unpack the fascinating details of systems thinking in action.
It's amazing how this systems view has completely changed how we see specific fields like biology. Remember how we used to think of cells as these tiny, self-contained machines?
Yeah, like little factories just churning away inside us.
Exactly. But now we see them as these complex, self-organizing systems that are constantly interacting with their environment, more like bustling cities than isolated factories.
I remember one of the sources used this term autopoiesis. It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. What does it actually mean?
It's a bit of a mouthful, I know. Basically, it means self-creating. These autopoietic systems, like cells, can actually produce and maintain themselves.
So they're not just cogs in a machine, they're actually building the machine itself.
Precisely. They're constantly regenerating their own components and boundaries while also exchanging matter and energy with their surroundings. It's like this constant dance of life.
One of the articles mentioned that this idea of autopoiesis isn't just limited to cells, though. It can apply to social systems too, right?
You're right, it can. But there is a key difference. When we talk about social systems, like businesses or communities, we're talking about networks of communication. They're also self-creating in a way, generating their own rules and boundaries. But the components are people individuals with way more autonomy than, say, the organelles in a cell.
So it's like the same principles are at play, but just on a different level of complexity.
Exactly. And that brings up a really important question. If we can understand social systems as these living networks, can we learn from nature to design them to be more resilient and sustainable?
That's a great question. It makes you think about all the challenges we're facing these days. Climate change, economic instability, social unrest. It's like these things aren't isolated problems, are they?
Not at all. They're all interconnected, part of this complex global system. One of your sources brought up the Gaia theory, the idea that the entire planet is a self-regulating system. It really highlights how much of an impact human activity has on that system.
So we're not just passengers on Spaceship Earth, we're part of the crew, and maybe not the most responsible crew members either.
That's one way to put it. The source material goes into the ecological impact of globalization, and it points out some pretty alarming trends. Deforestation, resource depletion, climate change. It's a stark picture, for sure.
It's almost like we've been stuck with this mechanistic view of the economy, focused on growth no matter the cost, without really considering the feedback loops, the interconnectedness of the whole system.
You hit the nail on the head, and when we connect that to the bigger picture, it becomes clear that we need a fundamental shift in our thinking. We need to embrace the principles of systems thinking, not just in science, but in economics, in politics, in every aspect of our lives.
It sounds like a pretty daunting task.
Yeah,
But do the sources offer any solutions?
they do. One of them dives into this concept of eco-design, learning from nature's principles of sustainability and applying them to human systems.
So instead of just extracting resources and creating waste, we start thinking about closed loops, renewable energy, mimicking the way ecosystems work.
Exactly. The source material has some really inspiring examples of how this is already happening. Regenerative agriculture, eco-cities, renewable energy technologies. It's not all doom and gloom.
There's hope. That's good to hear.
Absolutely. But it takes a collective effort, a shift in consciousness from seeing ourselves as separate from nature to understanding that we are deeply interwoven with the web of life.
You know, this deep dive is really about more than just understanding systems thinking as a concept, isn't it? It's about recognizing what it means for how we live, how we work, how we relate to each other, and the planet.
That's the core of it. It's about seeing the world with new eyes, recognizing how interconnected everything is, and then using that understanding to create a more sustainable, just, and vibrant future.
A future where we're not just cogs in a machine, but active participants in this grand symphony of life.
Beautifully put. So for you, dear listener, the question becomes, how are you going to apply this new way of seeing the world? What systems are you a part of? How can you use this knowledge to make a positive difference?
Those are some powerful questions to think about. But before you get too lost in thought, let's shift gears a little. We've talked about cells, societies, even the planet as systems. But what about the most complex system of all?
The human mind.
Exactly. Because if we really want to understand systems change, we need to understand the role of consciousness.
Things are about to get meta. In part 3, we'll explore how systems thinking can help us understand consciousness and how our minds are really systems within systems.
Okay, so we're back and ready to tackle the big one, consciousness. We've gone from planets to cells to social systems, and now we're diving headfirst into the human mind. Or should I say, the human mind?
That's the key difference, isn't it? For centuries, thanks to Descartes and his I think, therefore I am, we've been wrestling with this idea of the mind as something separate from the body.
But systems thinking challenges that separation, right? It's like, hold on, everything's connected, even our minds and bodies.
Exactly. What I find fascinating is how cognitive science is now echoing what Eastern philosophies have been saying for, well, millennia. The mind is embodied. It's not some ethereal thing floating out there. It's deeply intertwined with our physical being.
One of the sources uses this term, proto-self.
Mhm.
Sounds pretty technical. Care to break it down for us?
Think of it as this constantly updating map of your body's internal state. Your brain's creating this model, a representation of itself and its surroundings, and this proto-self forms the very foundation of your conscious experience.
So our brain is building a model of itself that's like a system within a system.
Exactly. And this model is constantly interacting with the outside world through our senses, our perceptions, our emotions. It's this dynamic dance of feedback loop between mind and body, mind and environment.
You know what's really cool about this idea of the embodied mind? It totally changes how we understand consciousness.
It does. Instead of seeing it as this big mystery, we can start exploring it through the lens of systems thinking.
So we look at the feedback loops, the interconnections, the patterns of neural activity that create our subjective experience.
Precisely. One of your sources mentioned this new field, neurophenomenology. Researchers are trying to bridge the gap between subjective experience and objective scientific observation.
So instead of just studying the brain from the outside, they're incorporating the first-person perspective, the view from within.
Exactly. It's a much more holistic approach, and it's leading to some fascinating insights. For example, this new understanding of the mind as a system is shedding light on things like the placebo effect.
Wait, the placebo effect, what does that have to do with systems thinking?
Well, it turns out the placebo effect isn't just some mind over matter trick. It's about the brain's ability to influence the body's physiological processes based on expectations, beliefs, even social cues.
So it's a feedback loop between mind and body, where our thoughts and beliefs can actually trigger physical changes.
Precisely. And when you see it through the lens of systems thinking, it makes perfect sense. The mind isn't separate from the body. It's part of the system, influencing the system as a whole.
That's incredible. It makes you think about the implications for healing, for personal growth, for our potential as human beings. If our thoughts are that powerful.
It really opens up a whole new world of possibilities, doesn't it? And it highlights the importance of understanding our minds as systems, learning to work with them, cultivating positive mental states, and harnessing the power of that mind-body connection.
This deep dive has been quite the journey. From the foundations of science to the frontiers of consciousness, and through it all, this thread of systems thinking.
It really is a powerful lens for understanding the world, absolutely crucial for navigating all the complex challenges we're facing today.
And what I love about it is it's not just some abstract theory. It's a way of seeing, a way of being that can empower us to create a better world.
A world where we recognize our interconnectedness with each other, with the planet, with the entire web of life.
It's a beautiful vision, and it leaves me feeling hopeful. So, for all of you listening out there, the journey continues. As you go about your day, look for the systems, the connections, the feedback loops. Remember that you are not separate. You are part of something so much larger than yourself.
As we learn to think in systems, we can act in systems, creating positive change that ripples outwards and transforms the world around us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into systems thinking. Until next time, keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep asking the big questions.